The dark story of America's largest mansion, Biltmore. Christmas, 1895. Snow. Beyond the gates in the Blue Ridge Mountains stands a house that doesn't feel like a house. A palace spread across 4 acres under one roof, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces. Beautiful. Yes. But that's just the facade. Behind these walls are hundreds of invisible hands, boiler rooms, laundries, long corridors for the staff, coal and steam. The bills pile up like a snowstorm. Then, taxes, the Great Depression, empty halls. To save the dream, the family must open their private world to crowds, a museum instead of a home, tourism instead of quiet. And there's more. Female leadership, bold decisions, and a price you don't see on postcards. Can beauty make you immortal? If it slowly eats your life? And the real question, who actually paid for Biltmore? And how much does this dream cost today? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Christmas morning, 1895. The Blue Ridge Mountains hold snow like a secret. The air tastes of wood smoke and pine. Beyond Asheville, North Carolina, past forests that run for miles, a private road climbs. Iron gates, a curve upward, and then a residence that refuses the word house, Biltmore. It rises from the hillside like a fragment of the Loire transplanted to America. Limestone walls, steep slate roofs, towers and turrets catching the winter light, 4 acres under one roof, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall whose ceiling soars roughly 70 feet, a library holding about 10,000 volumes. Beneath the stone and oak, a marvel of modernity for 1895. Electric light throughout, elevators, central heating from massive boilers, refrigeration, fire alarms, and call buttons set into the woodwork of principal rooms. Numbers signal magnitude, but they do not deliver the sensation. Stand in the entrance hall and look up. Stone climbs for 3 stories. A barrel-vaulted ceiling carries carved oak and painted detail, polished marble underfoot. Stained glass filtering winter daylight. The architecture is staged to overwhelm, to announce that you have stepped into something deliberately extraordinary. Step past the showpiece rooms, the library, the winter garden with its glass roof and fountain, the banquet hall with its triple fireplace, and the other face appears. Behind the beauty lies infrastructure. Deep in the basement, boiler rooms, the size of small factories, burn coal to feed the heating system. The laundries run industrial machines. Storerooms hold linens, china, crystal, and silver in careful order. The kitchens are laid out not for a family, but for an operation. There are servants' quarters and a servants' dining room, servants' staircases, narrow and unadorned, hidden from guests. Long service corridors, painted institutional green and lit by bare bulbs, weave a second circulatory system through the building. Staff move along these arteries unseen, so fires are lit before dawn, water runs hot before anyone wakes, and breakfast appears the moment it is wanted. Biltmore employs well over 100 people, maids, footmen, cooks, laundresses, stable hands, gardeners, foresters, drivers, electrical engineers to tend the wiring and generators, plumbers for the intricate indoor pipes, still rare in the rural South. Each post has a purpose. Remove one, and the mechanism falters. The cost of keeping Biltmore alive is heavy. Coal comes in by the ton. Provisions are purchased in bulk or produced on the estate. Wages go out every week. Maintenance never stops. A structure of this size always asks for attention. Leaking slates, hairline cracks in plaster, a pipe that gives way in a cold snap. The heating plant alone demands daily checks and seasonal overhauls. Christmas of 1895 is a triumph. Music rings in the winter garden. Garlands and candles dress the public rooms. Guests arrive by train, then ride by carriage along the winding approach. After dusk, the building glows with electric light, a beacon against the mountains. For a handful of days, the dream feels whole. Under the celebration, a quiet pressure gathers. The house is magnificent, and it is also a machine that eats resources at a pace difficult to sustain. The beauty is real. The cost is real. Together, they will govern every choice that follows. An unspoken question, present that morning, and sharper with each passing year, begins to form. How long can this last? To understand what comes next, you have to understand who made this place and why. Let's go back to the beginning. The man who conceived Biltmore was not what you might expect. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born in 1862 into America's wealthiest family. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, built a transportation empire of steamships and then railroads. The fortune was staggering. By the time George received his share, the Vanderbilt name signified power, influence, and money on a scale few American families had ever approached. But George was different from his brothers. While older siblings raised palaces in Newport and New York, hosted glittering parties, and chased society's approval, George disappeared into books. He was shy, soft-spoken, uneasy in crowds. He reportedly spoke 8 languages. His passions ran to art, literature, horticulture, and forestry. He collected rare volumes with the intensity others reserved for racehorses. He traveled often, mostly to Europe, studying architecture, visiting great estates, and absorbing how buildings and land could function as a single, purposeful whole. By his mid-20s, he had decided on something his brothers did not want. Not a showpiece for entertaining, but a private retreat, a working estate, a place to read, think, manage forests scientifically, and live quietly amid beauty and order. The question was, where? In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina with his mother. The town lay in a valley ringed by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was cool and clean, a draw for wealthy northerners escaping summer heat. The scenery was dramatic. The Southern Railway had recently extended service there, making it reachable without making it crowded. George was captivated. He began buying land, not a token plot for a summer cottage, but thousands of acres. Parcels accumulated, farms, wooded hillsides, eroded fields logged or exhausted by careless cultivation, and then abandoned. In time, the holdings exceeded 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many European principalities. The plan took shape steadily. George wanted a house that married European architectural tradition to modern American technology, grand enough to hold his art and library, yet practical. A year-round residence, not a seasonal ornament. He wanted the estate to support itself, farms to produce food, forests managed on scientific principles to yield timber without ruin. A model of what disciplined stewardship could do? The vision was ambitious. The vision was also expensive. George understood that. The family fortune, carefully invested, produced reliable income. In 1888, it seemed reasonable to believe he could fund both construction and ongoing operations. The initial budget for the house was reported at roughly $5 million, well over $100 million in today's terms. And that was only the beginning. To bring the idea into the world, George needed expertise he did not possess. He needed architects, a landscape mind, engineers, and managers, people who could translate intention into stone, wood, water, roads, and working systems. He turned to 2 men whose names would become inseparable from Biltmore's story. The first was Richard Morris Hunt, America's leading architect. Trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, Hunt designed mansions for New York's elite. Blending French Renaissance forms with modern construction, he understood scale and proportion, and how to make a building feel at once historic and current. When George approached him about Biltmore, Hunt was in his 60s, at the height of his craft and reputation. The second was Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect behind Central Park and dozens of other landmark projects. Olmsted was 70 when George hired him. His philosophy was firm. Landscape is not decoration. It is a living system. Plants, water, topography, soils, and views must work together. The goal is not to conquer nature, but to reveal its potential through informed, patient intervention. Together, George, Hunt, and Olmsted formed the core team. The dream had a visionary. Now it had designers. The next step was to build. That would demand resources, logistics, and human labor on a scale North Carolina had never witnessed. Building Biltmore was never a matter of hiring contractors and waiting. The scale of George's vision demanded planning that bordered on the military. Richard Morris Hunt arrived in Asheville and immediately grasped the challenge. The site, a plateau above the French Broad River ringed by mountains, was dramatic yet remote. Nearby suppliers could not deliver the required quality or quantity. There were no workshops for intricate metalwork, carved stone, or ornamental plaster. Even transportation was inadequate to move materials from distant sources to the ridge. Hunt's answer was methodical. He designed the house in a French chateau idiom, drawing directly on Loire precedents such as Blois and Chenonceau. Proportions were calculated with care. The facade balanced symmetry with lively massing. Corner towers anchored the composition. A porte cochere provided sheltered arrival. Inside, the plan guided visitors from grand public spaces, entrance hall, banquet hall, library, to progressively more intimate family rooms above. Beauty served function. Every ornament reinforced a structural line, framed a vista, or clarified circulation. Hunt also knew beauty meant nothing if the building could not be built correctly. His drawings specified materials with precision. Indiana limestone for exterior walls, durable, weather-hard, and responsive to carving, oak for interior joinery and floors, marble for fireplaces and accents, copper for the roof, costly but long-lived, chosen to endure for generations. Every piece was numbered, every dimension verified. At this scale, an error was not a blemish, but a liability. Frederick Law Olmsted confronted a different battlefield. His first survey left him dismayed. Decades of logging and careless farming had stripped the thin mountain soils. Hillsides were scarred by erosion. Creeks ran turbid. Native forests, once dense with chestnut, oak, and tulip poplar, had been cut over or cleared for crops that quickly exhausted the ground. The landscape was ecologically injured and visually tired. Olmsted's approach was restorative. He refused to ring a mansion with ornamental garnish and call it a landscape. He set out to heal the land. His plan called for large-scale reforestation. Hundreds of thousands of trees placed deliberately, with native species prioritized. Erosion control would come through terracing, contour plantings, and ground covers. The approach road, ultimately roughly 3 miles long, would wind gently through recovering forest, revealing vistas in measured sequence and building anticipation. Close to the house, vor Woestams der Haus, Woestels formal gardens would supply structure and color. Beyond them, a managed working forest would demonstrate that beauty and productivity could coexist. Both men understood that vision required infrastructure. George approved the outlay. A private spur of the Southern Railway was driven straight to the site. A brick kiln on the property fired millions of bricks for interior walls and chimneys. A woodworking mill turned timber into flooring, panels, and trim. A stone yard dressed limestone blocks. Temporary housing went up for laborers. At the project's peak, more than 1,000 men worked on the hill. The workforce was diverse. Stonemasons from Italy brought old-world cutting and setting techniques. Carpenters from Asheville and the surrounding mountains, practiced in the region's hard hardwoods, shaped the interiors. Brickmakers, plasterers, painters, glaziers, and metalworkers added their disciplines. For many locals, it was steady pay on a job unlike anything the region had seen, and the pace tolerated no carelessness. The logistics were staggering. Limestone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds traveled from Indiana by rail, then moved by wagon from the spur to the plateau. Oak beams, some more than 40 feet long, had to be hauled up mountain roads. Copper sheets for the roof arrived in carefully crated bundles. Every nail, pane of glass, and light fixture was ordered, shipped, inventoried, and installed to Hunt's exact specifications. Hunt and Olmsted worked closely while operating on different clocks. Hunt's house would require about 5 years to raise. Olmsted's forest would take decades to mature. Both men knew they were making something meant to outlast them. A question neither voiced publicly, but both understood lingered. Could even Vanderbilt wealth sustain ambition at this scale indefinitely? Construction began in 1890. The house would open for Christmas of 1895. What unfolded across those 5 years was equal parts artistry and endurance. The work began with earth and stone. Before Hunt's chateau could rise, the ground had to be made ready. The chosen plateau stood high above the river valley, but its surface was irregular. Crews cut foundations deep into the mountain soil. The basement level would carry the estate's organs, boilers, coal bins, laundries, storerooms. So the excavation was extensive. Tons of earth moved by hand, by mule-drawn cart, by sweat. Then came the stone. Limestone reached the spur by rail from the Indiana quarries, every block numbered and tagged to Hunt's drawings. These were not uniform rectangles. Many arrived pre-carved, arched surrounds, ornamental brackets, rosettes. Stonemasons set each piece methodically, course by course, following the plans. Mortar was mixed on site. In fair weather, the walls climbed a few courses a week. Rain and mountain cold slowed the lift. Precision was the rule. Hunt required tight joints and true lines. The Italian masons worked with techniques honed over generations, cutting to carry load, bedding voussoirs so an arch locked itself, carving profiles that would weather with grace. Speed was never the point. The mandate was centuries. As the exterior rose, other crews threaded the interior with systems. Biltmore would have electricity, still a luxury in 1890. Wiring had to be pulled before plaster. Standards were young and inconsistent, so engineers designed a bespoke system with a generator in a separate building to cut fire risk. Major rooms received electric light. Bedrooms got call buttons. The technology was modern. Installing it inside a structure dressed like the Middle Ages was an intricate puzzle. Heating was equally demanding. Central heat, rare in any residence and almost unheard of at this size, meant massive boilers in the basement circulating hot water through miles of pipe to radiators in every room. Insulation, pressure regulation, and constant tending were essential. Coal deliveries became routine. Engineers had to be on staff year-round. Comfort carried a standing price, steady fuel, steady oversight, steady expense. Woodwork added another tier of craft. Oak, chiefly American white oak, provided strength and figure. The library alone required carved paneling from floor to ceiling, a hand-worked ceiling, and a concealed spiral stair to the upper gallery. Carpenters labored for months on that single room. The banquet hall's triple fireplace rose nearly to the rafters, marrying carved stone and oak. Bedrooms received custom joinery. Bathrooms, several dozen in all, took tile underfoot and on walls, porcelain fixtures, and hot and cold running water. The human cost is hard to tally. The labor was punishing. Stone dust burned lungs. Heights were unforgiving. Winters bit hard and work slowed, but rarely stopped. Men put in 6 days a week, 10-hour days. Some slept in temporary housing on the estate. Others walked miles from Asheville each morning. Payroll ledgers in the Biltmore archives record hundreds of names. Stonemasons earned more than common laborers. Skill commanded a premium. Carpenters and plasterers drew day rates. Women staffed the estate kitchens and laundries, feeding crews and washing their clothes. For 5 years, this was a temporary town, held together by Vanderbilt money. And then, when the house was ready, it thinned and scattered. By 1894, the shell was tight. The roof, copper sheets carefully seamed, was on, destined to weather into that blue-green bloom. Inside, plasterers closed walls. Painters laid down coat after coat on trim and ceilings. Electricians tested circuits. Plumbers pressure-tested lines. Tile setters moved from bath to bath. Furniture was ordered from shops and makers. Art was purchased or brought from George's collection. Books came out of crates and onto shelves. Christmas of 1895 was the date. The house had to receive guests. It did. And even as the last fixtures went in, another part of George's vision was only beginning. The part designed to outlast the house itself. The forest needed attention. The house was finished. The forest was broken. That first Christmas, George stood in his library, surrounded by roughly 10,000 volumes, and looked out on land that unsettled him. Close in, Olmsted's work was thriving. The approach road curled through carefully restored woodland. The formal garden supplied structure and color. But beyond that cultivated ring, the wider estate told a harder story of decades of damage. The mountains had been cut carelessly. Lumber companies took the best trunks and left slashed to rot or burn. Farmers cleared steep slopes for corn and tobacco, crops that drained the soil within a few seasons, then abandoned fields when yields collapsed. Erosion tore gullies down the hillsides. After every storm, the streams ran brown with silt. The native forest, once rich with American chestnut, a cornerstone species for wildlife and valuable timber, was fragmented and in decline. George wanted more than a handsome view. He wanted a living, productive forest, proof that science could restore abused land while generating steady income. Properly managed timber could help offset the estate's operating costs. To do that, he needed a new kind of expertise. He needed a forester. There was a problem. In America, forestry as a profession barely existed. Europe, especially Germany, had practiced scientific forest management for generations, with schools, trained specialists, and tested methods. America had loggers and timber barons. The difference was fundamental. Logging extracted and moved on. Forestry managed for the long term. George consulted Olmsted, who recommended a young American just back from European study, Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was 26 when George hired him in 1892, even before the house was complete, and he was eager to put European methods to work on American ground. Pinchot surveyed the estate and saw both a mess and a gift. The mess was the condition of the land. The gift was the sheer scale. Roughly 125,000 acres offered room to experiment, to adapt European techniques, and to model what American forestry could become. His approach was systematic. First came a full inventory. What species were present? Where were healthy stands? Where was natural regeneration taking hold? Which areas were most degraded? The survey took months. Crews walked tract after tract, marking trees and logging measurements. And then came management choices. Pinchot introduced selective cutting. Instead of wiping entire hillsides, crews would harvest mature trees ready for the saw, leaving younger growth to climb into the canopy. That kept forest cover, reduced erosion, and protected future yields. He laid out fire breaks to keep wildfires from racing unchecked. In the worst areas, he launched reforestation, planting thousands of seedlings: white pine, yellow poplar, and oak, chosen for local fitness and commercial value. This was practical work, not decoration. Pinchot hired local men to plant, thin, and conduct controlled burns that cleared ladder fuels and lowered fire risk. He cut roads and trails to reach remote compartments. He tested techniques and kept records. The Biltmore woods became a living laboratory. Pinchot did not stay long. By 1895, he accepted a federal post and would eventually become the first chief of the United States Forest Service. Biltmore had been a proving ground. Practices refined here would shape national policy for decades. George replaced him with Carl Schenck, a German-trained forester with both classroom rigor and field experience. Schenck continued the program and pushed it further. In 1898, he founded the Biltmore Forest School, the first forestry school in America. Students lived on the estate and learned by doing, marking trees for harvest, calculating timber volumes, laying out roads, conducting prescribed burns, studying soils, and diagnosing tree diseases. The school ran for 15 years. It trained hundreds of foresters who carried scientific management across the country. Some into state and federal agencies, others onto private timberlands. A simple idea began to spread. Forests could be productive and sustainable, and deliberate care outperformed exploitation over time. Arguably, this was George's most consequential achievement. The house dazzled visitors. The forest changed an industry, but both house and forest demanded constant funding, and that funding, steady for now, still hinged on George's ability to pay. The bills kept coming. Christmas of 1895 arrived with snow and anticipation. The house was ready. Fires glowed in the hearths. Electric light washed the rooms. The winter garden, under its glass roof and central fountain, wore seasonal greenery. The banquet table stood laid for guests. Music moved along the corridors. For George, this was the moment the vision turned tangible. Guests came by train to Asheville and then in carriages up the winding approach. The effect was intentional. Glimpses through trees, then the full facade revealed at once. They stepped down beneath the porte-cochere and into a space meant to overwhelm. The entrance hall lifted for 3 stories. Stone walls, carved oak, stained glass, polished floors. The scale announced that they had entered something extraordinary. George was a quiet host. He did not imitate the Newport excess of his siblings. Biltmore's gatherings were smaller and more considered. Visitors explored the library with its hidden stair and rare books, the winter garden with tropicals thriving under glass in deep winter, the banquet hall where the ceiling soared roughly 70 feet, the basement bowling alley, and indoor pool. What impressed as much as architecture was technology: switches that brought light instantly, elevators gliding between floors, hot water in every bath, central heat smoothing the temperature of a building the size of a small museum. Beneath the celebration, practical reality never left the room. The house demanded constant attention. More than 100 staff kept Biltmore alive. Maids cleaned, changed linens, and guarded the finish of every surface. Footmen served meals, stoked fires, and answered call buttons. Cooks fed family and staff. Laundresses wrestled mountains of sheets and clothing. Engineers tended boilers and electrical gear. Groundsmen held the gardens and approach rode in order. Stable hands managed horses and carriages. Foresters looked to the woodland. Each worker drew wages. Each department ate supplies. Coal arrived by the carload to feed the boilers. Provisions were bought in bulk, or grown and processed on the estate's farms and dairies. Maintenance never slept. A structure this large always had a slate to reset, plaster to mend, a pipe to replace, a circuit to diagnose. Every fix required skilled hands and materials. The monthly operating costs were substantial. George had expected that. His share of the Vanderbilt fortune yielded income from railroads, real estate, EST, and finance. By any measure, it was considerable. The question was whether it was enough. George kept careful books. Ledgers in the archives itemize everything: salaries, coal, food, repairs, taxes, insurance. The figures are precise and daunting. The estate's productive arms were meant to shoulder part of the load. The dairy turned out milk, butter, and cheese. Gardens and glass houses supplied vegetables year-round. Orchards provided fruit. The forest, under Schenck and his students, began to generate timber revenue. These streams mattered, but they could not equal the cost of operating the house itself. George believed he could hold the balance. He had resources and resolve. He loved Biltmore, the hush of the library, the mountain views, the proof that scientific forestry could heal land. This was retreat, vocation, and legacy at once. Yet the pressure was real. Each month brought bills. Each month funds moved to meet them. The house was magnificent. The house was also a machine that burned money at a rate even Vanderbilt wealth might not sustain forever. George's answer was discipline. He avoided spectacle. He limited guest lists. He invested in productivity. Expanding farms, refining forest work, hunting for efficiencies wherever he could find them. The hope was simple. Over time, the estate would carry more of itself. For about a decade, the balance held. The house functioned. The forests improved. The settlement beyond the gates. Biltmore Village, created to house workers and provide services, became a tidy community with church, school, shops, and cottages. Wages were fair by contemporary standards, housing decent, management paternal, but for the era, comparatively enlightened. The estate looked stable. The dream looked sustainable. Then forces beyond George's control began to change the math. The years after that first Christmas settled into rhythm. George never meant Biltmore to be ornamental. From the start, his vision included productivity. The estate would be beautiful, yes, and it would work. Farms would supply food. Forests would yield timber. The land would help pay its way, or at least shoulder a meaningful share of its own upkeep. The farms expanded steadily. The dairy grew into one of the largest in North Carolina. Jersey cows grazed along the French Broad River pastures. Milk was processed on site, some for household and staff, the balance sold in Asheville. Butter and cheese added steady revenue. Quality stayed high because George insisted on modern sanitation and proper animal care. Practices still uncommon in much of the rural South. Vegetable gardens and glass houses fed the kitchens year-round. Tomatoes, lettuces, cucumbers, beans, roots put by for winter. Orchards gave apples, peaches, and pears. Hogs and chickens supplied meat and eggs. The aim was practical self-sufficiency, cutting exposure to outside suppliers and volatile prices. In the woods, Schenck kept the forestry program on course. Selective logging provided a reliable trickle of timber to local mills. Not spectacular, but consistent. More importantly, the forest was knitting back together. Erosion slowed as ground cover returned. Wildlife crept back. Reforestation plots from the 1890s matured into sound young stands. Biltmore Village, the community George built beside the gate, became a small model of planned development. Richard Sharp Smith, Hunt's supervising architect, set an English cottage vocabulary: brick and stucco, slate roofs, humane proportions. A church, a school, a hospital, shops for goods and services, cottages for workers and their families. George's labor policy was paternalistic, yet comparatively progressive for its time. Wages arrived reliably. Housing was kept in good repair. The school educated workers' children without charge. Medical care was available. George believed well-treated workers were more productive and loyal. It was sound business as much as charity. The result was a community whose living standards outpaced many southern mill towns and mining camps. Social life at Biltmore stayed intentionally restrained. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, and she shared his preference for quiet over spectacle. They entertained selectively, small dinners, weekend guests, an occasional concert in the Winter Garden. Nothing like the costumed extravaganzas in Newport where orchestras played till dawn. Restraint was partly temperament. George truly preferred books to crowds, and partly arithmetic. Every grand ball burned through thousands of dollars. Every house party pulled in extra staff, extra food, extra coal. Operating costs were already heavy. Unnecessary display only worsened the math. Daily operations ran on choreography. Staff worked in shifts so fires were tended, call buttons answered, and meals prepared around the clock. A household manager coordinated schedules and standards. Edith oversaw domestic arrangements with the housekeeper. Linens, china, menus, guest rooms. Detail by detail. The estate functioned like a contained town. Supplies rolled in by rail on the private siding. The blacksmith shop repaired tools and tack. The carpenter shop built furniture and handled joinery repairs. The garage housed motor cars. George was an early adopter and saw that automobiles would overtake carriages. For a time, the system worked. Investment income covered the remaining deficit. Farms and forests contributed. The estate employed hundreds, supporting families across the region. Biltmore became Asheville's largest employer and a point of civic pride. Yet the balance was delicate. Cash had to move in an unbroken stream. Any shock to George's investment income, a market slide, a recession, would bite immediately. There was little safe room to cut without shuttering parts of the house or dismissing staff, steps that would undercut the estate's purpose. George managed with care, watching expenses, chasing efficiencies, refusing waste. He hoped the estate's productive capacity would keep growing as costs steadied. He did not foresee two oncoming shocks, one fiscal, one personal, that would bend Biltmore's trajectory. The first came from Washington. By 1910, Biltmore had reached a kind of equilibrium. The house had been running for 15 years. Systems were settled. Staff knew their roles. Farms were productive. Forests, under scientific management, produced steady timber income while visibly recovering from decades of abuse. George and Edith had a daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900. The family lived quietly, winters at Biltmore, and summers traveling or staying at other properties. The estate looked stable. The dream felt secure. Then Washington changed the rules. In 1913, Congress ratified the 16th Amendment, creating a federal income tax. Until then, wealthy Americans paid little direct tax to the federal government. Local property taxes existed, but income largely went untaxed, the ground on which the Vanderbilt fortune had accumulated and grown. The income tax changed the math. A significant share of George's annual income, the money that carried Biltmore's operating costs, now went to the federal government. Rates began low and rose quickly for top earners. Each year, George transferred substantial sums to Washington, dollars that had previously covered coal, salaries, and repairs. The effect was immediate. The careful balance of income versus expense tipped. Operating costs did not fall. The house still demanded fuel, labor, maintenance, and supplies, but the money available to meet those costs shrank. George read the ledgers with mounting concern. Cuts would be necessary. Where to cut? Every department felt essential. Dismissing staff would cripple operations. Shuttering rooms would undercut the estate's purpose. Trimming farms or forests would reduce the very revenue that helped. George began to adjust. Travel was curtailed. New purchases were deferred. Non-critical maintenance was postponed. Vacant positions were not always refilled. The changes were incremental and cautious, intended to preserve core function while easing cash outflow. He believed he could steer through. The tax was permanent, but the estate could adapt. Productivity could climb. Expenses could be shaved. With time, a new equilibrium might emerge. Time ran out. In March of 1914, George traveled to Washington, District of Columbia, for medical consultations. He had been struggling with health issues, complications from appendicitis, by most accounts. The condition worsened abruptly. Surgeons operated in emergency. George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington on March 6, 1914. He was 51 years old. The news reached Biltmore by telegram. Staff, village, and region felt the shock. George had been a quiet presence, yet his vision shaped everything. The house, the forestry program, jobs, and civic support. His death opened a void. For Edith, the loss was intimate and operational. She had lost her husband and inherited a strained enterprise. George's will left Biltmore to Edith for her lifetime, then to their daughter Cornelia. The bequest included all assets, house, land, farms, forests, and all obligations. Edith sat at George's desk in the library and studied the numbers. The picture was sobering. Monthly operating costs were large and largely fixed. Farm and timber revenues helped but did not close the gap. The difference had always come from George's investment income. That income still existed. His estate was substantial. But federal income taxes and the costs of settling the estate reduced what was available. The arithmetic was blunt. As then operated, Biltmore cost more to run than it generated. Without significant change, the estate would draw down capital until within a decade perhaps funds would be exhausted. Edith faced a choice. She could attempt to preserve the estate exactly as George envisioned, likely ending in bankruptcy and forced sale, or she could make hard decisions now, while options remained, to ensure that something endured. She was 43 years old, a widow with a teenage daughter and an estate that employed hundreds. The responsibility was immense. But Edith was pragmatic, intelligent, and tougher than many realized. She began to plan. Edith understood what many wealthy widows of her era did not. Sentiment could not pay bills. She loved Biltmore. George had built it as his life's work, and she had helped make it a home. But love would not keep the boilers firing or the staff paid. The estate was bleeding cash. Without decisive action, everything George created would vanish within a few years. The first step was assessment. Edith hired accountants and lawyers to examine the books end to end. Their findings confirmed her fears. Annual operating costs hovered around $250,000, roughly $7 million in today's currency. Revenue from farms, the dairy, and timber covered perhaps one-third. The remainder depended on investment income already diminished by federal taxes and by the costs of settling George's estate. The arithmetic was unforgiving. At the current pace, capital would be spent within a decade, sooner if major repairs or a downturn struck. Once funds were gone, creditors and tax collectors would move. The estate could be seized and auctioned. Edith weighed her options. She could liquidate everything at once, live comfortably elsewhere, and close the chapter. Many advisors urged exactly that. She refused. Biltmore was more than memory. It sustained hundreds of families in a region with limited opportunity. The house itself was irreplaceable, a pinnacle of Gilded Age architecture, filled with museum-grade art and furnishings. So she split the problem. The house and its immediate grounds were the irreplaceable core, the part of George's vision worth saving. The vast forest holdings, while important, were negotiable. In 1915, Edith opened talks with the federal government. The United States Forest Service, newly established and for a time led by George's former forester Gifford Pinchot, was seeking large tracts for national forests. The land George had assembled and managed scientifically was exactly what the government wanted: contiguous acreage with proven potential for sustainable management. The process took time. Surveyors had to mark lines. Boundaries required verification. Appraisers set values. Lawyers on both sides worked through terms. Congressional appropriations and politics added complexity. The sale closed in 1916. Approximately 86,700 acres, nearly two-thirds of the original estate, transferred to federal ownership. The government paid a fair figure, though less than George had invested in purchase and improvement. The transaction formed what became Pisgah National Forest, named for Mount Pisgah, the peak visible from Biltmore's terraces. The sale achieved Edith's main objective. It generated capital to retire debts and build a cushion for what remained. It also ensured that George's forestry experiment, the work launched by Pinchot and advanced by Carl Schenck, would continue under federal care. The Biltmore Forest School closed. Schenck returned to Germany, but the forest itself would be protected and managed on principles George had championed. Edith retained roughly 8,000 acres around the house and village. Still substantial, but manageable. She could concentrate resources on the core without the crushing expense of administering tens of thousands of acres. Next came operational cuts. Headcount fell gradually through attrition and targeted layoffs. Edith tried to soften the blow. Severance where possible, letters of reference, help finding work. Departments were consolidated. Household staff shrank from more than 100 to roughly 60. Still large but sustainable. Maintenance was triaged. Essential systems, heat, electricity, plumbing, went to the front of the line. Cosmetic work waited. Unused wings were closed. Vents were shut to save coal. Formal gardens were simplified to reduce labor and inputs. Edith cut her own spending sharply. Guest lists narrowed. Entertaining became rare. Travel turned minimal. She focused on Cornelia's education and on keeping the estate solvent. Her method was calm and unsentimental. She kept detailed ledgers, reviewed accounts monthly, and questioned every expense. Restoring Biltmore to George's full vision was no longer feasible. The goal was lean continuity, a smaller operation that could live within its means. Through the 1920s, the strategy held. The estate stabilized. Bills were paid. Staff received wages. The house was maintained, if not lavishly. Cornelia grew up, married, and began a family. Then came 1929. The stock market fell. The Great Depression began, and Edith faced her next crisis. The crash arrived in October of 1929. Stock values collapsed. Banks failed. Businesses shuttered. Unemployment soared. An economy that had felt prosperous and steady through the 1920s revealed its fragility. Fortunes evaporated. Even well-diversified families watched their assets shrink. Biltmore was not immune. The investments that underwrote the estate's operating income lost value. Dividends thinned or stopped. The cash flow Edith relied on for wages, coal, supplies, and repairs turned uncertain. At the same time, the Depression gutted Asheville and the mountain counties. Tourism, growing through the motor-age 20s as Americans took automobile trips into the Blue Ridge, vanished almost overnight. Vacations were a luxury no one could afford. Hotels stood empty. Restaurants closed. Shops strained to survive. Unemployment in the area rose past 20%. Edith faced a grim ledger. Income had fallen. Expenses, though far leaner than in George's era, remained substantial. The farms and forests produced revenue, but nowhere near enough to fill the gap. Further cuts were possible. Dismiss more staff, darken more rooms, postpone everything but emergency maintenance. Yet there was a floor beneath which the house itself would begin to fail. Stone structures demand constant care. Neglect invites water, water breeds rot, plaster loosens. Small problems become structural. A few underfunded years could require decades and a fortune to undo. Edith considered selling. Brokers proposed breaking up the land for development. But who would buy in a depression? And even if parcels moved, the house would likely be doomed. Too large, too costly to run, impractical for any use but the one George intended. Then someone, the precise source is unclear in surviving papers, suggested a radical step: open Biltmore to paying visitors. For Edith's class and generation, the idea bordered on scandal. Privacy was a creed. The thought of strangers filing past your rooms, studying your possessions, felt unthinkable. Edith was pragmatic. She had already sold 2/3 of George's mountains. She had cut staff, closed wings, simplified operations. Opening the doors to visitors was the next logical adaptation, and it offered something more than relief for the estate. Asheville needed work. If Biltmore drew tourists, those travelers would lodge in local hotels, eat in local restaurants, and shop on local streets. The estate itself would hire guides, ticket takers, and grounds crews. At a moment of near universal idleness, this could put people back to work. She decided Biltmore would open to the public in March of 1930. Preparations were substantial but frugal. Rooms were arranged for viewing. Ropes and barriers guided visitors and protected furnishings. Routes were mapped. Staff trained for crowd flow and questions. Tickets were printed. Notices ran in regional newspapers. Admission was set at $1 per person, high enough to matter, low enough to tempt visitors in hard times. The tour would cover the principal public rooms: entrance hall, banquet hall, library, winter garden, and selected bedrooms. Private family quarters would remain closed. Guests would enter at the front, follow a prescribed path, and exit at the side. The circuit was planned for approximately 2 hours. Opening day carried real uncertainty. Would anyone come? Would people in a depression part with $1 to see a house? Would Americans find the experience inspiring or voyeuristic? Attendance exceeded expectations. Visitors came from Asheville and outlying towns. Some arrived on foot, others by car, a few by wagon. They paid their $1 and stepped into the house George had raised and Edith had fought to keep. They entered the hall and looked up at Stone climbing 3 stories. They stood in the banquet room beneath the triple fireplace and the ceiling that soared roughly 70 feet. They lingered in the library among thousands of books. They studied paintings, tapestries, furniture, and carved details. Some came from curiosity. Some because they had worked on the estate or knew those who had. Some came for hope, to be reminded amid collapse that beauty and craft could still exist. The revenue was modest but meaningful. More important, the model worked. Biltmore had found a new purpose. Not a private home, a museum. The 1930s passed slowly at Biltmore. Tourism brought revenue, not abundance. Visitor numbers rose and fell with the economy. In the worst Depression years, attendance was thin. As the late 30s improved, more people came. The estate stabilized without prospering. Edith balanced maintenance against ticket income, aware that a single bad season could trigger a crisis. Then came December of 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War. Tourism halted almost at once. Gasoline was rationed. Rubber was scarce. Civilian automobile travel became difficult, then nearly impossible for leisure. Young men left for service. Families focused on getting by, not going away. The visitors who had carried Biltmore through the Depression vanished. Edith faced another financial cliff. This time, an unexpected option appeared. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, District of Columbia, had a problem. Its collection, paintings, sculpture, and historic documents of immense cultural and monetary value, needed protection. With the nation at war and fears of bombing or sabotage in the capital, the gallery sought a secure site far from Washington to house its most important works. The requirements were exacting. The location needed to be inland, away from coastal threats. It required controllable climate, stable temperature and humidity for fragile art. It needed security, isolation, and restricted access. And it needed space, large rooms, to hold hundreds of crated pieces. Biltmore met every condition. The house sat in the mountains, far from ports and primary targets. Rooms were vast, with high ceilings. The structure was stone and largely fireproof. Mountain air was cool. George's heating system, installed half a century earlier, could regulate interior climate. The estate was private, gated, and reachable by limited roads that were easy to monitor. Negotiations proceeded quietly. In 1942, the first shipments arrived. Trucks rolled in at night bearing wooden crates stenciled only with numbers. Guards accompanied them. Crates entered through service doors and were carried to secure rooms. Chiefly the first-floor music room and several large upstairs bedrooms with minimal windows, stable temperatures, and ample floor area for safe stacking. The contents were extraordinary, though few at Biltmore knew specifics. The crates reportedly held works by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, and Gilbert Stuart, including Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the image on the $1 bill. Paintings worth, in the aggregate, millions of dollars, sat in darkened rooms while war burned overseas. Security was discreet. Armed guards patrolled, dressed in civilian clothes to avoid attention. Staff understood that something important was stored and were told not to discuss it. Edith herself rarely entered the storage rooms. Representatives from the gallery visited periodically to verify temperature and humidity and to inspect conditions. The arrangement continued through 1942, 1943, and into 1944. A house built for beauty and entertaining now served as a vault. The winter garden fountain still whispered. Lights still glowed in the library. But the halls were quieter than they had been in decades. Few visitors, minimal activity, guards on rounds, and crates holding a portion of America's artistic inheritance. For Edith, the arrangement carried several benefits. The government paid rent, not a fortune, but reliable income while tourism had ceased. Federal guards effectively secured the entire estate at no cost to her. Most of all, the partnership affirmed Biltmore's significance. The house was not merely a relic of Gilded Age excess. It was a national resource trusted to protect culture in crisis. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. As peace returned, the National Gallery began retrieval. Crates were loaded, trucks departed for Washington, and the rooms at Biltmore were emptied, cleaned, and restored to their former uses. The art survived the war unscathed. Biltmore proved its worth not only as home or attraction, but as guardian of beauty in darkness. The house had found another purpose: protect her. And in that role, Edith recognized something essential. Biltmore could serve. If it could serve, it had value beyond George's original vision. If it had value, it deserved to endure. The question became how to secure that endurance permanently. The post-war years brought new pressures and new thinking. Edith guided Biltmore through the 1940s and 1950s, building tourism as automobile travel resumed and the middle class grew. But she was aging. Born in 1873, she was in her 70s by the early 1950s. The question of Biltmore's long future could no longer be deferred. Her daughter Cornelia had married and divorced and spent long stretches away from the estate. The next line, Cornelia's sons, George and William Cecil, would inherit responsibility and, with it, the decision of what Biltmore should become. There was no obvious path. The house was vast, costly, and increasingly complex to maintain. Tourism, the model Edith had pioneered, generated revenue but not the kind needed for large-scale capital work. The estate existed in a precarious balance, solvent yet brittle, one major failure away from crisis. In 1963, Biltmore was designated a National Historic Landmark, a formal recognition of its architectural and historical weight. Prestige came with obligation. This place could not be allowed to slide into genteel ruin. Its preservation mattered beyond the family. William Cecil, taking primary charge, understood that survival required professionalization. Biltmore could not function as a private home occasionally open to callers. It had to operate as a business, a cultural site with professional management, strategic planning, and stable, diversified income. Change arrived deliberately through the 1960s and 1970s. Tourism was expanded and refined. Visitor facilities improved. Marketing grew more sophisticated. The estate began hosting events, weddings, conferences, seasonal festivals, carefully selected to align with the site's character. The winery, launched in 1985, added both a revenue stream and a reason to visit. Farm production continued, now with goods sold directly to guests. Expansion demanded restraint. More visitors meant more wear. Every body adds moisture, tracks grit, and touches surfaces. The task was to maximize income while minimizing harm. Preservation became systematic and continuous. Sections of the copper roof, now more than a century old, required repair or replacement. Limestone needed cleaning and conservation where pollution and weather softened carved detail. Interior oak needed refinishing. Plaster demanded steady patching. Electrical and plumbing systems dating to the 1890s had to be modernized discreetly, retaining historic character while meeting safety and reliability standards. The work was painstaking and expensive. Specialized craftspeople, stone carvers, plasterers, metalworkers, conservators, had to be recruited or trained. Materials were matched to originals. Every project began with research, moved through planning, and ended under tight quality control. Preservation was not a campaign with an end date. It was a permanent responsibility. Modern technology was threaded in lightly. Climate control improved to protect furnishings and art while reducing energy use. Fire suppression was upgraded. Security added unobtrusive cameras and alarms. Solar panels on outbuildings, screened from view, helped lower operating costs without disturbing historic sightlines. The forestry legacy continued. Remaining woodlands were managed sustainably, balancing timber income with ecological health. Reforestation and habitat work persisted. The principles established by Gifford Pinchot and Carl Schenck proved durable a century on. By the early 21st century, Biltmore had become one of America's most visited historic houses, drawing over 1 million guests annually. The estate employed approximately 2,000 people, far more than George's original staff, and stood among the region's largest private employers. The economic impact across Asheville and western North Carolina was substantial. The transformation was complete. Biltmore began as one man's private refuge. Realized with Gilded Age capital, it survived through adaptation. Edith's hard choices, the family's willingness to share what had been private, and the clear-eyed recognition that preservation requires public access, professional operations, and diversified income. The house George built for quiet and study now serves millions. The forests he healed for science now invite hikers and naturalists. The estate that once strained a fortune now sustains livelihoods. The lesson is plain. Beauty by itself is not enough. Grand visions need resources. Resources without adaptation guarantee failure. Biltmore endured because its stewards were willing to change its purpose while protecting its essence. Who paid for Biltmore? Workers who built it. George, who funded it. Edith, who saved it. Visitors who sustain it. How much does the dream cost? More than money. It costs vision, sacrifice, adaptation, and the humility to let great things live by learning to serve. The house survived because it learned to serve. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Tell me in the comments, which historic house should we explore next? The Breakers in Newport, Hearst Castle in California, Lyndhurst on the Hudson, or perhaps something unexpected, a forgotten mansion with a story waiting to be told? These places aren't just buildings. They're chapters in America's story, built by real people, paid for with real costs, and preserved through real struggle. Every mansion has its shadows. Every dream has its price. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.